Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today to our Tuesday Times Roundtable. Just gonna take a moment to allow a few more of you in and wait for your audio to get connected. All right, well, welcome everyone to today's online Tuesday Times Roundtable. Today's topic is on creative mischief, making art in the age of artificial intelligence. And it's going to be led by one of our dear friends from the Office of Global Learning Initiatives, Danny Fernandez, and I'm going to be introducing him shortly. For those of you that haven't heard about TTR, this is the Office of Global Learning flagship discussion series that brings together multiple perspectives on global issues and trends. All TTR sessions are always connected to the United Nations development goals and also to a news article just to continue the conversation. And they're also recorded for future reference in our YouTube channel. You may take a moment to sign in by scanning the QR code listed on the screen or also accessing the link in the chat. This is how we're going to be record today's session attendance, whether you're here for Global Learning Medallion points, Global and Honor Scholarship Engagement points, or extra credit from your professor, or whatever brought you to us, we're happy that you're here. My name is Janeri Mendoza Farjan, and I'm the Senior Program Coordinator for the Office of Global Learning Initiatives. And then with us, we also have my amazing team. So just want to give a big shout out to our Assistant Vice President, Dr. Hilary Lander. Also, Michelle Saldivar, Assistant Director. Connie Penchak, Assistant Director. Rola Sar, Assistant Director for Global First Year Initiatives as well. And then our dear Agustina, who is our student intern and supports with our social media. Okay. So for those of you that are not familiar with our office, we do have amazing programs available for all undergraduate students. This includes the Global Learning Medallion Program, the Peace Corps Prep Program, Millennium Fellowship, and there are also other scholarships and fellowships available. So you may access these programs at goglobal.fiu.edu/students. Also, we would like to extend an invitation to a very nice session that we're going to have on Tuesday, April 14th. This is part of the New York Times speaker series. We're going to be featuring the journalist Carlos Lozada. So if you haven't heard about it, please visit go.fiu.edu/NYT. Or you may also register for the session by going to the link go.fiu.edu/NYT RSVP or accessing the QR code on the screen. Okay. And as I mentioned, the TTR sessions are always connected to a news article. Just to continue the conversation, if you would like to access the article for this week, you may go to go.fiu.edu/TTR0331. And this is because FIU has a partnership with the New York Times that provides everyone with digital access. So you may activate your account at accessnyt.com. Today's session is also connected to SDG number 9, Industry, Innovation, and Infrastructure by building resilient infrastructure and also promoting inclusive and fostering innovation. All right, and now it is my great pleasure to introduce today's presenter, our dear friend, Danny Fernandez. He is the Academic Operations Coordinator for the Global First Year Program at FIU and also a graduate student in the Master of Fine Arts in Visual Arts at the FIU CARTA. A little bit about Danny. He's an artist, a teacher, a writer, a poet who works as an Academic Operations Coordinator at FIU. He earned both his bachelor's at FIU in English literature, and as I mentioned, he's also pursuing his master's degree at the moment. Danny is also a Radcliffe Fellow, where he's developing his art practice and working on bioplastic made from sargasso. He's also passionate about the arts, the humanities, and education, and he loves helping students feel excited about learning, He has taught the first year experience a course, and then he also supports international students as they begin their studies here at FIU. Welcome, Danny, to today's Tuesday Times Roundtable. I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Joneri, and thank you all for being here. I also want to thank the team again for this wonderful event and for having me here. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Let me go ahead. There we go. And so today's conversation is really a continuation of a conversation I was having last year. Last year, I went to the College English Association to present on Keith Haring and artificial intelligence. Because many of you will see this as we go along in this presentation, but in 2023, 24, Keith Haring has a work from 1989, a year before he died, that was completed by someone who saw it on the internet and immediately decided that they wanted to make this piece become finished. But the point of that piece was Keith Haring had left it unfinished purposefully to share the issue with AIDS that he was going through and his passing because of that illness, and bring attention to that as an artist. And so it's this question always about art and AI that happens every so often. Everyone, thinks it's the end of art as we know it because this machine can automatically create and produce artworks that people tend to think look very well done. I really like to bring up, this concept was discussed with a colleague of mine and also my professor, Jacek Kolasiński. Much like this machine, a lot of us are trained on image, are trained on ideas, and then we tend to ideate from that point. That's why there's always this conversation of like, what is a new idea in the world? And I think it really brings to mind what Ladson Billings says, when she was creating her courses, her law courses in ethics, one of the things that she would do for her students to break them out of that mold of like, what is ethical, is she would show the bill of sale of her ancestor as a slave. And so it's one of those elements that we can do for this machine. And another important element of all this is, when we look at counter narratives and these things, which I will talk about more later, and how we can make the machine go beyond itself. And so really, when my key points for today's conversation, is AI and archives. What is an archive? What is AI? Again, archives essentially are points of history that we've sort of collected into a specific place in which we can go back and reevaluate things and sort of create a historical lineage off of those things. AI is usually trained on data sets, which oftentimes data sets pull from archives that exist already. And so when we think about these two concepts, we have to always realize that both are not neutral. AI is obviously learning from a particular set of data points that the archive is itself creating. And so sometimes it's not getting the full picture or breadth of a certain story in history. Other big things is, again, going into critical fabulation. So Saidiya Hartman, this is a really good quote by her. It is a history of an unrecoverable past. It is a narrative of what might have been or could have been. It is a history written with and against the archive. So when you're thinking about this concept of critical fabulation as she has created it, you're really thinking about how it is that certain parts of history are basically left unwritten or unsaid. And especially she likes to look at, similar to Ladson Billings, these moments in history where you have a particular, just a line that's sort of written about a person, but that one line tells you so many things, but also nothing at the same time. And that's the issue with an archive, is that we see, especially in that quote comes from Venus in Two Acts, from Hartman's work. And essentially in that work, she's just talking about these enslaved women that essentially are, the only way that we know that they existed is from the court case in which someone is being sort of one of their slave owners is essentially saying, you know, that this person existed, but in a way that is diminishing their existence, calling them a Venus or giving them a sort of tertiary name. They're just an object. And so when we're thinking about this process, you know, making art and creating image, a lot of our art making has to come from this idea or ideas that we have been presented, right? And it's the same with AI, right? It can fabricate in the same way that we can fabricate, but it can also be critical if we teach it to be critical, if we create prompts that incite that criticism and allow us to sort of flesh those things out. And so, oh, I think I skipped one of my slides. Let's see. No. So one of the big things, forces shaping AI, you know, honestly, a lot of us have anxieties about this. You know, as I said earlier, in the art world, we keep having this discussion of how it may replace artists, how it may take away from the art process. I'm here to basically dispel a lot of those anxieties because even when it is doing something that is relatively well done, it's still missing a lot of the context. You know, if you put in information, it's going to be shaped by that information, right? It has its bias embedded in those data sets and those aesthetics, histories, and bodies that aren't necessarily brought up. Oh, I think I lost the share there for a second. There we go. Cool. But AI is not neutral, and that's where the creative power comes in. So we have to reframe this question of, you know, AI taking over more so in terms of how do we shape what AI imagines? How do we shape what it's pulling and how it's changing those kinds of conversations with its archive? And so earlier, let's see if I can. There we go. Earlier, I talked about the Keith Haring work. So this is the original sort of inspiration for this conversation that we're having today. If you'll notice, here's the original unfinished work. Here is the actual like finished work that somebody made on the internet by feeding it to AI. If you know Keith Haring's lines and also his style, it really doesn't do a good job of emulating his style. It's very like there's no people here in this side that is complete. They've been sort of mishmashed into just line, and there's not that continuation of personhood. So then you now have this image that this thing created that's fully lost of its context. It's based solely off of a continuation of whatever is here or what it believes will come next. Some of the more controversial elements of art making with AI, people tend to really be drawn to artificial intelligence when it's generating images or realistic images of people that have come before. So you'll see here in the work of Bas Uderwijik, you have Van Gogh, if he was sort of brought forward in time. You have Napoleon, you know, just based off of these artworks, they've tried to recreate with AI how they would actually look. And then it's important to bring up Jason M. Allen's Theatre Opera, de Opera Spatiale, because in this work, this was one of the first AI works to actually win at an art fair. It was later rescinded, and more of that is available in my resources. But still, it was that turning point where people thought, you know, this machine could potentially produce something of value. That happened in 2022. You'll see like some of these works are actually predating 2022. So using more GAN. So even Bas Uderwijik was using more not GPT-4 or 5. He's very much creating his own kind of data sets, etc. The same goes for Jake Elwes. But the reason I put, and I kind of place them on this tangent, but or this like spatial awareness. So all these on this side, except for maybe Keith Haring's unfinished painting, these are people that are kind of following the trajectory of the archive, kind of filling in these artworks with that in mind. Whereas the folks over on the right are becoming creative and playful with these systems. And these are all artists that work with these works. So for instance, Jacek Kolaszyński, who's my professor, he has this Creole archive of the Polonais Noirs, which were the Polish soldiers that went with Napoleon um, into um, Haiti during the revolution. And so in that time, we don't really have a record of what occurred, but we do know that based off of the Haitian um, what is it called? The document, the constitution that was created. In that constitution, all people who were in Haiti were now considered black. And so they also said, and the Polish. So there's this question of, they stayed, they actually were a part of that. And so Jacek tries to bring in that element of history that is forgotten and have this AI produce images of what that would have looked like because we don't have any paintings. There's no real record of these individuals. And so he's testing the fringes of that archive. Then you have, people like Nick Breeze, who's actually just trying to disrupt the AI and glitch it in a lot of ways to produce sort of harrowing images. This is very similar to, if you used to produce images at the very outset of AI, they would come out sort of, missing fingers and sort of not exactly human-ish, right? Um, and so in this work, he actually is using a more current feature, but he's trying to go in and break down the AI and the archive and the data sets to play with what it could produce. And then Jake Elwes, he created his own GAN or his own GPT. And in that, he fed it many images of what he claims, he says are drag kings, queens, and things and allowed them to kind of recreate a cabaret, and it's the song from Cabaret. And so it's the ZZ show, and it's multiple like just iterations of drag queens. So feeding this machine ideas counter and sort of a new narrative of what it would have understood. Then the final one here is the abolition of man. So this is two artists, Carson Grubaugh and Sean Michael Robinson, but also Luciano Floridi, who's a information theorist, and particularly now with AI, sort of the ethics of AI. And they took the essay Abolition of Man by, I forget now who it was, but needless to say, they took that essay and they created this work using initial like DALI, which was one of the very first popular GPTs, and then later the one that creates images. It's called something with an M. I'm blanking on its name right now, but again, here's that counter: is all of these creatives developing, actual graphic novels or archival documentation or representing marginalized people versus people just trying to sort of profit off of what already exists or what already came before and not really training the AI on the context of that work. And especially as an abstract artist, one thing that you can tell immediately from abstraction is when there is a context and when there isn't. And so that's one of those elements. I mean, all of this gives us an opportunity for alternative histories, for marginalized perspectives, for speculative futures. And, we want to try and move away from thinking of it as just a reproduction machine. And the prompt itself has a politics, right? It's a site of power. It allows us to reconstruct these erased histories and just think about what these communities have been historically denied. Doing so can be done through generative image, text, sound. And I mean, I just want to give you all like, before we move into like the next part, just some element of my own creative process. So when I first started playing with ChatGPT, it was in class and in the Radcliffe, and we were just given this idea to create an orchid planter. And for me, I always had a fascination with green men. And then I also love these like ovens that, have the facial kind of constructions. And so I fed it these two images and I just sort of asked it, develop an orchid planter that has a large radius to accommodate the growth of a particular flower that I wanted, which is the black orchid that I have at home. It should have holes to allow for airflow, etc. Obviously, just based off of that. ChatGPT loves to give its opinion, so it automatically talks about all of these things. I didn't need all of that necessarily. And so then I just started telling it more specifically what I need. Generate a 3D concept, render or sculpture reference for Blender or 3D printing based on this description. So now I'm getting more into the weeds of how I want this to come forth. Um, and I gave it its proportions, its airflow, etc. And so this is just ideating, how you ideate with this machine and how you can actually, move beyond just thinking of it as a reproduction machine, right? So they gave me this after I said that previous prompt. So I said, remove the flower and the design. I would like this to be a hanging design using the leaves around the face as mounting points, make the holes look more like this. And I shared it this sort of image. And, then I kept, fine tuning it, telling it that it needs to still maintain these things because obviously once it gets another image, it changes. And so in the end, I was able to get it to actually create something that fit my description because I wanted something that sort of sat on the wall that I could put the flower into, almost like these coconuts here that we're seeing that are very common here in Miami, and just integrating two different design aesthetics and ideas. And then obviously, I ran it through Meshi AI and then had it create an actual STL file that could be printed. So you get some little click of that process. But this is just one way that we can play with AI and make it be more creative beyond what its thoughts are, right? Or what it's sort of producing. And so the final result ended up being this little like mask like piece. And for us as artists, it takes one step because sometimes, for instance, I'm not a big ceramist. I'm not used to creating slab pieces and then going in and creating these little things. So it was difficult for me to conceptualize this. And so by using ChatGPT, by using an AI, I could actually push myself to have the idea created, and then later I can mold this and make multiples of it if I wanted. And that's just one way that we have to think about ChatGPT is that it's part of the process. It becomes a collaborator rather than um, not having any context, not having any perspective. So before we get into this activity, I just want to review if there have been any questions along the way. And if you do have questions, please drop them into the chat, just so that, I can field a few of them before we move into our next component for today. No questions so far? Okay. So if anything at the end, we'll save that time for questions. So what I want us to think about, so this is an image from the Hampton House Hotel. It's courtesy of Malcolm Lauredo Hampton House, and it was colorized by Diana Ibarra, but it's Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in the pool. And, often when we think of civil rights leaders or, people in these places of power, we don't necessarily see them beyond what they've done. So I want people to look at this. So here's my questions to all of you, since you didn't want to ask me questions. What do you see? How would you describe this as someone who had never encountered it? Some of the people I've shown this to have already said, "Oh, it looks like AI." So it's not. It's a real image. It was actually taken at the Hampton House. But I'll give you all a chance to answer some of these questions. And think attentively, like, when you look at this image, notice maybe little details that weren't necessarily picked up in the first round of just me talking about it? What are some minute details that I may have not even picked up on? That's the thing about art. It's and even just photography. It's about attentive looking. All right. Michelle put a photo of MLK in a pool where everything under his shoulders is warped by the water and reflecting light. I love that. Right. Anything else that we want to add about the photo? Other things we can say. Oh, there we go. His expression is relaxed but squinting into the sun. Excellent, Michelle. So yeah, look at all the details. He's kind of caught off guard almost, like he is smiling, but he's also just squinting because of the sunlight. There's a shadow underneath him. It looks like there's some kind of aberration going on here in the water. Someone here says, Rena says, the patterns in the water look too perfect and repetitive. I mean, Miami in the sun, sometimes it can look that way, right? And water in the sun here. The shadows appear inconsistent. Interesting. Isabella puts, I'm not sure if this was intentional, but the reflection is shaped like an arrow facing up. Huh. I'm trying to see where that is. Arrow shaped up. I mean, I see this like aberration that kind of looks like a arrow, like pointing, but I think it might just be the water or something like a splash. But yeah, see, when we take a second just to look at an image, we automatically start to understand it and think of it in a sort of different way. And definitely, this was recolored, it was colorized by someone. So there may be some effect from that because even us as humans, we struggle to replicate sort of these natural things. So here we have someone who's actively recreating this painting, but maybe made mistakes with the water, maybe had issues capturing the correct lighting, the shadows. I mean, all of these like inconsistencies are human inconsistencies. And that's why sometimes for us, it's like, oh, but this could very well be AI. It's because similar to AI, we are learning machines in a lot of ways. We are reproducing based off of our perspective. So I want us to actually collectively construct a rich, layered, and culturally informed prompt. Now, we could decide to use this image and feed it into the AI and just ask it to sort of reproduce more of that day if we would like. But I want to leave it up to you. So maybe it's something because for us personally, how many of us really know when we hear about ancestors of our own or a family member of our own, how many of us actually know what they did for fun on a daily basis? Even our own grandparents, they'll tell us like, oh, this is what we did in our country or here in the US when we were kids. But what did that look like? I'm going to throw Kanye under the bus a little. She told me recently that her dad went to a David Bowie concert in the 70s or 80s. And it's like, oh, that's great. But I would love to know what dad was actually like doing at the David Bowie concert. Like, was he front row? Was he headbanging? What was going on? So we have the ability to do the same now with this AI. So maybe somebody wants to volunteer a particular figure from history and a particular activity that they could be doing. And I'm actually going to stop sharing so that we can pull up ChatGPT and create our prompt. So let me go ahead and grab that. I'm already seeing people putting up their ideas. Perfect. So in the chat, we have flamenco dancing. All right, so we have an activity. Okay, flamenco dancing. Somebody else, offer me a historical figure that is going to be flamenco dancing. Stalin. All right, we can drop that in. Oscar Wilde. That's a good one as well. Let's think in terms of what we've discussed so far. So now we have flamenco dancing, we have these two figures, very different timelines in history, so they wouldn't necessarily interact. But let's think about how we can be critical of that situation, how we could feed ChatGPT a sort of critical lens in viewing this. So maybe George Washington, going really far back. Um, let's think about a particular place, maybe Oscar Wilde. Let's go with Oscar Wilde because I feel like that's a very good figure. Where would he be flamenco dancing? Um, think about his like biography personally, if you know it, Asne. Um, maybe in one of his many parties, potentially. Paris, that's a good one. Okay. Um, now we all know Oscar Wilde in that era later got persecuted for being a gay man. And so potentially, if he's doing this flamenco dancing, do we want him to be dancing with a man? Yeah. So let's go ahead and try and feed it that. So create a historical image. I'm going to go this way. Create a historical image of Oscar Wilde in Paris, flamenco dancing with partner. We're going to feed it just that. How's everyone feel about the prompt? Do we want to add more to the prompt, give it a little more uh, zhuzhing up? All right, I see hand. Everybody's okay with it. Let's drop that in and see what happens. And it even decided at a Parisian cabaret. And so here we have our image of Oscar Wilde in his dance. I want to ask some questions before we continue to refine this image a little more. So let me pull up my presentation once more and share presentation mode again. Okay. Are we seeing we're seeing this screen here. Weird. Okay. So we'll just go to my questions here. There we go. So what did it produce? What did it miss? What did it flatten or refuse, if anything? So I'm gonna stop sharing there, and I'll type this uh, into our chat so that you have it. Yeah, this is a very interactive piece, so everybody will see that there. And I'm gonna put the image back up. So what is it not giving us? What is it? I mean, what are our thoughts here on these questions? Maybe miss the city background from the brainstorm. Yeah. It's hard to know without knowing more about what should be there. Exactly. And that's one of those elements that we need to think about. Like, what should be happening in this moment? What are things that potentially it doesn't know about Oscar Wilde, for instance? his features don't quite capture his facial features well. Exactly. Yeah, it's side profile. Um, and it made him, I guess, more into the like the Hollywoodization, I would say. They made him look less like himself just to kind of fit the mold of what we were asking of it. Um, so very good, Connie, very good, Matthew. Um, so maybe we want to refine it. So what could we add that should be there? A band potentially. Um, let's see. Okay. Instead of a region.
Yes, Jorge had a comment. The
Yeah.
removal of the dress is trying to add, so
Oh
it seems
yeah.
like it's adding dress elements to the
That's
image.
an excellent point, Jorge. See, those are why is it giving Oscar Wilde a dress? Why is it automatically gendering Oscar Wilde, right? In this kind of way, right? We personally don't know. Maybe, I don't think Oscar Wilde dressed in dresses ever. So we can add that as well. Actually, we can even question it. Why did you decide to give Oscar Wilde a dress? Didn't intentionally decide that Oscar Wilde should be wearing a dress. What likely happened is a mix of artistic and stylistic blending. So now it's automatically trying to justify, flamenco costuming influence, and it's feeding you the archive, right? Because the prompt asked for historical and oil painting style, it pushed toward exaggerated romantic aesthetics rather than strict realism. So it's following the archive right there. It's like, oh, if you're traditionally dancing flamenco, there should be a feminine partner, or there should be a partner who's utilizing feminine characteristics, like having a dress, at least in this context. And then ambiguity emotion, the dark flowing lower half could be interpreted as either trousers or a skirt-like garment, creative liberties with identity and performance. So it's now justifying saying that, he had a flamboyant fashion, but one thing is being a dandy from the 18th century, and the other is wearing a dress, and especially since he would later be criminalized, and we could say that about it, right? We could say um, Oscar Wilde was criminalized and persecuted for the suspicion of being gay. We consider or recreate this image with that in mind. Um, and then we can add some of the things that we've said. Also, make the backdrop actual Parisian streets in the 18th century, as well as add a band. And let's see what comes up now. Yeah, so right now my current plan has a slower model, so we're going to take a second to see what it comes out with. And see, every time I feed it something, it's like it's failing to replicate. It's like under Parisian lights. Did I say Parisian lights? It always sort of infers nighttime. It did fix the issue, so now it knows. And then there is our band. Anything else we notice about the image that's sort of changed that maybe we haven't looked at? So going back to those questions, now that we've produced the second one. Okay, we got one new. The background city change. Yes. So Matthew, we asked for it to sort of be outside. Somebody put Asne said it is lacking something necessarily indicative of Paris. He was known to enjoy carousing outdoors, so we could have him doing about the same with other representative intellectuals of the time in front of the Seine River. Exactly. So we could completely alter it from this dance scene towards something more akin to the history itself. Someone put the distortion of the arm for the male dancer on the right. Yeah, it's like this arm became a mix between the two of them. Now it's just one arm together. So it's going to have these errors um, consistently that come up. But even its choice, like why did it choose to create this image this way? Why didn't it? Maybe we, instead of saying a historical painting, we take it a photography. We could alter it in so many ways to reproduce images that are very different. Um, but that leads me to the like next part of the presentation. And let me just stop sharing and share my screen. So in that next part, what would it take to make AI know this work? And is that even desirable? So what would it take for us to get it to understand the context of that period? Um, Beyond what it may have in its mind, because obviously we don't necessarily have a record of Oscar Wilde dancing flamenco in Parisian streets. It very well could have happened. Maybe there was someone from Pamplona visiting at that time and sort of having this musical moment and teaching people on the streets of Paris. Um, but there's no necessarily evidence of it. So how do we make it move into this like critical lens that we ourselves are kind of in already? So Matthew says, feed it specific information such as time period, how the dancers need to look as examples. Exactly, being very specific. One thing that my professor Jacek, and I don't have this image, but he has an image of Dessalines that he recreated off of many paintings. And Dessalines, as you know, is or no, it was yes, it was Dessalines, one of the Haitian revolutionaries. And so he actually had to feed it many archival evidence of like what was worn by soldiers in that time period. He had to also think about like how would it look different for like the Polish soldiers? So many of them are wearing straw hats because they had to adapt a wool suit into a more comfortable thing, etc. So Jorge says, give it articles and historical information beforehand to guide it and drawing examples. Exactly. The same way that you yourself do this kinds of research to learn about a given topic when you're going to create an art piece, whether that's a piece of writing or a piece of artwork, you need to have many historical guiding principles in that process. That's not always the case, but it helps to know those things, right? Connie says, agreed. I would even add photos of figures if I want to capture images in a more accurate way. Yeah. So in another iteration of this, we could drop in photos and painting references of Oscar Wilde and drop those in so that we get an idea of a better representation of him. Maybe we even find some descriptions of what he was like, because I know there's a famous quote where essentially energy takes like parties and this lifestyle take a lot of energy out of him, and then when he's by himself he just becomes secluded and doesn't want to see anyone. So maybe we include an element of that about Oscar Wilde in that piece. But again, we're critically fabulating. We're critically thinking about an era that we don't have much of a record on, and we're trying to pull joy and moments of like that we take for granted on a day-to-day basis. We could even just have Oscar Wilde alone, sitting in a field, writing, the importance of being earnest. These are things we don't know what it would have looked like. Would he have sat at home? Would he have sat outside? What was his process for creating? And I'm sure there's plenty of records that we could pull from, but specific things, we don't see what it looks like. And so the next part, data sets and archives, uh, they have elements that they preserve and they have elements that are erased. And oftentimes, with all of these historical figures, that's something that we tend to see, if sort of selective forgetting. Even with like Keith Haring and Andy Warhol, these are two figures that, it's only been 30, 40 years since they've been gone, and we're already seeing erasure of who they were, right? There's a famous set of prints by Andy Warhol called Sex Parts, and it's a very visceral, sexual, explicit set of pieces that he created. And it's very much true to his sexuality. It's very much true to who he was and is. And yet, never do we hear about those pieces. Never do we hear about how he navigated his own sort of existence and personhood. And that's already being lost. It's already not necessarily being preserved. Very few people probably know about that piece. Even Keith Haring, very similarly had pieces that discuss, his love life, the people in his life. And all of these pieces, unless you are in a museum archive or unless you're at the Smithsonian, et cetera, you're not going to get access to. So AI is just learning from what we're automatically feeding it. We're not giving it what it needs to. And the danger, like what we saw earlier, is that style without context becomes aesthetic theft. And so these are two figures in pop art and abstraction, but as an abstract artist, it's always about what can't be said directly, and AI can say it effortlessly, but it can say it wrong. And we're seeing that even with images that we're generating here, right? It kept getting a lot of elements wrong just based off of what it's pulling from the archive. And so we have to think of AI as a collaborator. We have to think of it as another part of the research process. This is something many people have probably already shared in other conversations here with TTR and across the university. But you need to think about how you audit your inputs. One of the things that unfortunately our society is very much go, go, go. And it's just, I need this email created and sent, and I can't, sit down and develop it over an hour. I need to just produce it and move on. And so we need to have that attentive control. We need to think about every element as we're going. And that's why when you're using AI as a collaborator, it's like really take a look at it, look at the data, look at the prompts, look at the references, you know, build a collaborative community rooted AI project like what we're having here today, where all of you had an opportunity to do this. GA says it's helpful, but you must check the sources it is using. Exactly. Exactly. Where are you pulling this data from? Where are you grabbing this idea of this perspective? Like it can't just be whatever it produces you take at first sight. You have to think about what it's gonna bring up. So thank you for
Danny, we do
yeah,
have a question for you because
talk to
you
me
did share a little bit about the creative process with
for
the
sure.
ceramic and also the creative process using ChatGPT. But
Right.
as an artist, I we're curious on what is something that as an artist that they can use AI in the creative process and what they should avoid. Considering that AI is creating images that artists used to produce themselves. So what is something that AI should be used as an artist and what should be avoided?
Definitely. Great question. I mean, again, when we're creating artworks, it really should be a conversation with what we personally are hoping people will learn from a piece, right? Um, it should go beyond just I'm creating this aesthetic object and more so what that object is trying to convey. And I think a lot of people, especially like the piece I made earlier, I'm trying to grab historical references that from my childhood just felt very connected to me. It wasn't necessarily just, I wanted this one idea. It's that I wanted something that connected to like nature. And so I wanted a figure that represented nature. And so I chose the Green Man, which is historical gardening, often you'll see that figure there. Some say it's a pagan god. No one really knows its sort of reference, but we see it in a few cultures. And you want to think about what it's saying about the human story, what it is saying about your own process. I think avoiding things that are harmful, like finishing an artwork and not giving context, like that one person, if we go back to the beginning, taking Keith Haring's work and finishing it and then never talking about why. He just says the story behind this painting is so sad. Now using AI, we can complete what he couldn't finish. Again, he left this intentionally blank. He did that so that you knew he had passed and he had passed from AIDS. And, that's a whole historical moment in history that by just blanketing it in, this creation by this machine now gets lost in the story. Now we tend to just think, oh, but they finished it. Great. That that is problematic, right? That is the issue. And then just accepting what the machine is producing as its own sort of merit. I think we need to challenge the machine. Um, if we go back, so other things, archive as contested, future as open. That's something that we want to always consider when we're creating art. Every image that we're exposed to is like consistently we have to like know why we're using it, what it means. So there's a really good point that my professor shared with me a while ago in class, and somebody had created a design of like one of those cleats that you see on boats, right? So like when you go to a boat yard, you tie a rope on this thing and it basically holds the boat. Well, the cleat was a pair of feet and he chose bronze to do it. And so now ocean and Atlantic slave trade are being represented by this piece. And so when you're creating artwork, if you're not looking at what that image could say, that could lead to so many issues, right? I recently had another student in a class mention to me that they were, and it was kind of scary. They were pulling images from Nazi Germany, like video recordings, and adding modern day images like from advertisements, etc., and putting them together. And I asked them like, why would you bring these two images together? And he said, oh, I want to bring the history into the present. And that just opens a whole can of worms because, you're saying you want to bring Nazi history into the present. So these are the kinds of conversations that as artists we need to consistently think about. Dr. Landorf says it is well known that AI is intensely male oriented and the majority of the input has been from males. How can AI be coaxed to be something for which it doesn't have enough content or enough other perspective? So that's excellent. I mean, that's why the idea of critical confabulation comes up, Dr. Lambdorf, and it's really we have to push it and have it think like the image that my professor made of Dessalines. He's taking a black man who historically is never shown in a role, at least in our Western archives, in a role of power as a general and leader of a country, and having it produce him as the leader with all of the Polish soldiers behind him and their um, white soldiers. And so for him, it took hours to feed it this idea because it doesn't have that representation in its sort of mind, in its data sets. And so we have to do that. We have to, find maybe undiscovered, let's say we find an archive of woman creators that are bringing for like just brought out of its I guess storage or someone's collection, private collection. We have to do our diligence and feed that to this AI and teach it that there are other perspectives and historical narratives that exist. And even when it's just a singular line, it's like taking all of these singular lines about a person and their history and helping it develop an image and a story from those ideas. So I think that's how we could develop this context and coax it out of this male dominated patriarchal sort of idea. But yeah, that more honest biographical archives as an act of resistance. We need to, as artists and creatives, be mischievous. And that mischief is just being good researchers, to be fully honest. So I got you with the title if you came in because you thought it was going to be more creatively mischief. No, it's just being a good researcher is sometimes creatively mischief.
Wonderful. And Danny, one more question. In your art pieces, if you can think about what could be developed in AI to support artists, what would be that feature that you would like AI to have
So
to support
really,
art pieces?
honestly, as I said, it's a collaborator. So if it's picking up on the fact that there's something missing in the archive that isn't necessarily discussed, that itself can notice, I think that would be really relevant because then it's not so much a need to prompt as it is a need to have a discussion with the machine, right? So in the future, as it gets more advanced, it becoming not self-aware, but at least aware enough that it understands like, oh wow, I'm being given all of this stuff, but there's things that I'm not seeing. Um, and how can I be more equitable? So I think just the companies that are currently creating these things need to think in terms of more equitable production, more equitable look at archives. And that needs to be a conversation that happens for my art process. Um, because honestly, there are moments, even we struggle to know everything and we have to sit down and go and look at an archive and start researching. But if it from the outset is a collaborator and not so much a machine that we dump our information into and then it feeds it back to us, I think that would be far more helpful as an artist. Yeah. And so these are my works cited. I'm gonna leave it a little open. I don't know how much time we have left. If you have any questions or any further comments, but I want to thank you all for taking time out of your day today to join us. Where can you find this presentation? I'm sure Joneri would be sharing it with you.
Absolutely. I can definitely share the presenter's presentation, and also this session is being recorded. So you're going to also find it in our YouTube channel at go.fiu.edu/TTR YouTube. We want to thank you, Danny, for your time, for sharing also the use of AI in today's age as well, and being a student here at FIU. Thank you for sharing your insight and also the best way how we can feed this ongoing resource that is available now for all of us. We really appreciate your time, and we want to thank everyone that attended today's session as well. Just as a reminder, TTR is going to continue next week. We're going to have our last TTR session that is going to be online. This is going to be from the Peace Corps organization. We have a return Peace Corps volunteer, also the former campus ambassador and the Peace Corps recruiter coming over to talk about media and the Caribbean, a Peace Corps service perspective. And then, as I mentioned earlier, we're going to have another in-person session, but it's going to be a New York Times speaker series that is going to be on April 14th. So make sure that you join us in person in GC 150. If you would like to share your feedback with us, feel free to go to go.fiu.edu/TTR feedback. And we look forward to seeing you again next week. Thank you so much for coming.